Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Shannon Horvath, and this is my presentation on my research paper. The name of my paper is How Stereotypes Are Broadcasted in the Media. So, for a little background on this paper, I wrote it at UCF in my ENC 1102 class, and it's supposed to be about something in our life that we have noticed and something that we have perceived. I chose this topic because there's a lot of prejudice in America, and a lot of it is focused on the African American community. As a member of this community myself, I did feel like this topic could impact me, and it was my job to educate the public on something that we may not have been paying attention to. Even though, in my newer generation, we do not watch the news on television as often as our parents, there are still stereotypes that are taking place which can shift our own perception of the people and the community that they belong to. When it comes to the news, African Americans are portrayed in a very negative light compared to white people who are broadcasted for the very same crime. The lack of equal representation in the news is what causes the viewers to see Black people in a way that is strongly different from the way they see other races. This topic is solely focused on criminals within the news and their news stories. Though all criminals should be sentenced correctly for committing illegal crimes, they still belong to a race group in America, and the way that they are portrayed will reflect badly on the hardworking citizens who identify with that race. That leads me to my thesis, which is African Americans are negatively portrayed in the news and broadcasting media. The news should not misrepresent the African American community because it's causing viewers to have an inaccurate perception of this group in America. When images or words are chosen in the news to describe a character or a suspect, they are chosen strategically, and most of it is negative, representing the African American community. This type of habit causes racial profiling and attacks on the Black community. African Americans being ridiculed is nothing uncommon in America. African Americans are shown with their mugshots in the news when they are reported of a crime. However, there are cases when white people who commit a crime, they are shown with professional images or even family photos that makes them look less threatening, regardless of what crime that they had committed. And then the words used within the news is also a very big issue. African Americans are portrayed as thugs, whereas that word is not typically used towards other race groups. This topic is extremely important and significant because of how many people it is affecting in their everyday lives. Aside from personal experience of myself, where people believe that my community and my family could be dangerous based off of what they see in the news, it is also true that many people suffer from the same problems as well. On the news, the choice of images that are shown of the criminal for the crimes are appalling. As a society, we need to take a step back, view this issue as something that's more than just a simple race issue. If the same crime is committed, the choice of language or images should be the same as well. This gives a sense of unity so that we may not have a negative perception of just one specific race group. In the images below is an observation and analysis of one of the sources for my paper. As you can see, there are two images of different cases that have taken place, and it's the same broadcasted news outlet that have posted them. On the left is of 3 Caucasian men who have committed the crime of burglary. They have images in a suit and tie for the case. On the right is of African Americans who have committed the same crime of burglary. The images shown of these men are completely different from the left side. They are mugshots that do not depict the African Americans as upstanding citizens. The men to the left have legitimate mugshots from the actual crime of being arrested, but the news outlet chose their professional pictures instead. And even if the African Americans did not possess a student-time image, which is not clearly identified, it shows that the news outlet wanted to make the white men appear less threatening. This, among others, are prime examples of how the perception of people can be very significant. The many studies that I have researched and conducted, which will be talked about at a later time, have shown that the appearance of danger and threat through the news can create a bias towards a race group. The effects will not only impact the suspects when it comes to sentencing and their trial, it will also negatively impact those who are of the same race group that live in America. The negative perception of them can cause racial profiling, as well as being perceived as dangerous when that statement could be quality false. So, going through information that was used in my paper, is one of them is meaning making. Researcher E.B. Gunvald created an article called Capturing Meaning Making in Journalism. Meaning making is a central feature of journalism practice. The minimal success of journalism fundamentally depends on the production of media text units, printed articles, broadcast programs, which are supposed to be meaningful to readers, listeners, and viewers. This shows that they seek highly in journalism to create a meaning for the people that are viewing and the people that are listening. And they have the sole power of creating and shifting a certain view. This means that you can use meaning making and rhetoric to create your own meaning of how you want things to look. Through the information that I've received with meaning making, it emphasizes thoroughly how some news stories implicitly link Black people to dire circumstances in this community, such as poverty, violent crime, drugs, and prisons. According to Florida statutes of 8-12-13, robbery is the taking of money and other property, which can be subject to larceny from the person or custody of another. Linking a race group to these types of factors can cause the perception that most members of this group are engaging in activities that are illegal and detrimental to the well-being of this country. My next source that I have used within my paper is from researchers Abraham Linus and Apia Osai. They created an article called Framing News Stories, the Role of Visual Imagery in Priming Racial Stereotypes. Within this, they conducted an investigation and experiment by testing how African Americans with a negative news story can possibly affect the perception of African Americans to the viewers. Their research consisted of evaluating the images of online news stories. Some of the images included white people and some that included Black people. The researchers conducted a study using 177 white undergraduate students at a Midwestern university around 20 years old. It was a voluntary experiment, and some of the news stories were of the 3-strike crime laws, as well as school vouchers. The only differences between the 4 versions of the news stories were the images that went along with them. Some of them were randomly selected using images of just white people, no image at all, Black people, and a Black person and a white person. After each news story, the participants were asked their perception of how each population or area will be affected by the specific public policy, and rated on a scale of not at all to extremely affected. The results concluded that Blacks were perceived to be affected more, and the study demonstrates that implicit visual imagery of a Black person alongside stories that are seemingly race neutral can influence the way white participants perceive how certain populations are affected by specific issues. Implicit racial images of Blacks help prime racial stereotypes about Blacks and led to the stronger association of Blacks within social problems addressed within the stories. Another article used was from Franklin D. Gilliam, and he created proximity, and local television news on attitudes about race and crime. Throughout this article, we investigated the interaction of exposure to stereotypes, reinforcing local crime news, and neighborhood racial contexts of attitudes about race and crime. For this experiment, white neighbors of various neighborhoods were analyzed to view the racial context of each respondent. Then they exposed the respondents to either racially stereotyped or non-stereotypic crime stories in the local news programs. When exposed to racial stereotypes, white respondents living in white, homogeneous neighborhoods endorsed more punitive policies to address crime, expressed more negative stereotypic evaluations about blacks, and felt more distant from blacks as a group. The Caucasian Americans that they encountered due to being exposed to media that portrayed African Americans as being dangerous. And that created a bias within their heads about black people that they have encountered and were exposed to on the street. There are many different articles with the same results of this, of them priming and seeing how the images and the words used within news stories can affect how somebody feels or how comfortable they are around different race groups, specifically African Americans. And the research all concluded that the use of words and images within the news is negatively impacting the African American community. There are some statistics here. According to the news and other media outlets, outside of sports games, the representation of African Americans in popular video games drops precipitously, with many of the remaining featured as gangsters and street people. Another, black males are underrepresented in the roles of computer users or technical experts in television commercials, instead tending to appear in roles that put less emphasis on intellectuality. And the last one is African Americans are also underrepresented as users of luxury items in commercials, instead being featured using more pedestrian consumer products. There are many gaps within the literature that I have analyzed and seeked out. And the main gaps is finding the solution to this problem. Many of it having to do with the fact that there's not much they can do if someone commits a crime and the crime is just bad, so they don't care how the person is affected or portrayed because of it. However, because people who did not commit the crime are also being badly affected, it is something we need to take into account and deeply put more focus towards. I feel like the difference and the gaps between the literature show that they are portraying and analyzing all this, specifically white people, to show that they do have negative perceptions and ideologies between the African American community. So from my perspective, though explained thoroughly throughout this paper and the presentation, I truly feel like there are so many ways that African Americans are negatively portrayed in the news and our media. That is something that's very apparent, and it causes bad stereotypes. So, I propose that there should be laws in place that makes it very strict when it comes to broadcasting and journalism, which makes all types of images that are shown when it has to do with criminals, regardless of their race, it needs to be the same. Though journalism is very free and expressive, I believe the news itself is a technique that's supposed to educate the community, and therefore it should not have any kind of bias within any of it. That will create a negative stereotype that I personally, along with other African Americans in my community, have been badly affected by. Keeping the uniformity in every news outlet will allow people to create their own perception, while the news can still perform and educate people on the laws. Also, social media is big, so they should create outcry when the news is violating these conditions. In conclusion, there needs to be effective change in order to make progress within this country. It all starts with representation. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and have a wonderful day.